But if you look at how prices collapsed, it is clear that the information of the ceasefire was leaked about 12 hours early, because as Iran was sending those missiles to Qatar, we saw prices drop substantially, which does not make any sense. But it makes sense when you know that the news of the ceasefire was leaked. Trump is telling China that when he was negotiating the ceasefire with Iran, he literally put this as a condition that Iran will not cause any problems in the Gulf. It is part of the ceasefire deal that the Iranians will not cause any disruptions. And he wanted to convey that message quickly to China by telling them there are no problems.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everybody. This is a conversation we're going to be having about the fallout of the, well, seemingly what's called now the 12-day war, Iran versus Israel, but with a specific angle. As with everything, energy is a core driver, a core feature of conflict, of instability. And someone who I have been long appreciative of their work is Anas Al-Hajji, who is the managing partner at Energy Outlook and someone who writes a fantastic thread on Substack. They have a commentary on sort of energy geopolitics related to Iran and Israel, but also something that Anas was describing to me before we got on to air, that he wants to really talk about, I think initially, right, Anas, that sort of there's something happening with China. What is it that you're seeing unfold there that you think is of particular interest to readers and viewers?
Well, generally speaking, I would like to answer kind of like specific questions because people are asking those questions around the world. People were concerned that the Iran-Israel war basically will lead to the closure of Hormuz. And people are asking what will happen if Hormuz Strait basically being blocked. And we should really drop this question completely. This question should not be asked because it's a waste of time. And the reason why, because the Hormuz Strait cannot be blocked. And Iran cannot block the Hormuz Strait. And the tightest point, basically, the Hormuz Strait is 33 kilometers. So it's very wide and well protected by the US Navy, the British Navy, the French Navy, the Indian Navy, the Saudi Navy. And then there is a coalition of 34 countries that are in charge of the safety of navigation in the Gulf of Oman and the Strait itself. And that coalition, basically, the headquarters are based in Bahrain. So it is well protected. No one can block it. Iran does not have the capability to block 33 kilometers in the tightest point. But here is the other issue that people do not know about. If you go and look at the map and you look where the ships and the tankers are, you see all of them are, or most of them, on the Omani side, not on the Iranian side. And the reason why, because the water is very shallow on the Iranian side and very deep on the Omani side. So for Iran to block it, if they can, they have literally to occupy the Omani side where the ships are, and that's not going to happen. So that's really a major issue here, that the water is very shallow on the Iranian side. That's why when you look at the map, you see most of the ships basically are on the Omani side. You see only the smaller ships and the local boats basically are in the Iranian waters. But more important than that, it is not in the interest of Iran to block it, even if they can. And the reason why, because most of their imports and exports go through the strait. So about 80% of their imports, including some items that they eat on a daily basis, even the cooking oil basically is imported through it. And then all their seaborne oil exports are exported through it. And as we know, their economy is in a very bad shape. Their currency collapsed, and they need the money. So to block themselves does not make any sense. But even there is more issues more important than that. And probably the audience will be interested in those percentages that I'm going to mention. 83% of the oil, 83% of the oil that is leaving the Gulf goes to Asia, to literally Iran's friends. And how much of that goes to the United States? Very tiny amount that comes from Iraq. 87% of the LNG exports, 87% goes to Asia. How much of that goes to United States or Israel? Zero. So Iran's friends will be hurt more than anyone else. And Iran itself will hurt itself if it does that. So between those two ideas, that Iran cannot block the Hormuz Strait, and it's not in the interest basically to block the Hormuz Strait, and then there is one more point. If you look at all the terrorist attacks in the region, none happened in the Strait. None. But the media keep telling us about the Strait. The attacks happened in the Gulf of Oman on the side or in the Gulf itself, but not in the Hormuz Strait itself. So you put all those three together, you can see that we should not be talking about blocking the Hormuz Strait. We should be talking about some groups that are aligned with Iran, causing some problems on either sides of the strait. That's where the discussion should be. But even then, we have enough evidence from history to show that these events' impact on oil market and LNG market is very limited. The biggest event basically we had when 4 oil tankers been attacked near the Fujairah port, and oil prices went up by $1.50. Of course, people cite the attack on Aramco in September 2019, but that's not in the Gulf. That's on the Saudi, that's on the land. So the issue here is that any way you look at it, there is very limited impact to any Iranian action or Iranian cronies, if you want to call them, very limited action. And the last point on this is people were kind of confused why President Trump said now China can import Iranian oil. As we all know, there are sanctions on Iran. So what he meant by that. And I'm glad to say that we were the first one in our reports to tell our clients and readers, look, Trump is telling China that when he was negotiating the ceasefire with Iran, he literally put this as a condition that Iran will not cause any problems in the Gulf or in the Gulf of Oman or in the Strait. And he is transmitting the message to China, look, don't worry, Iran is not going to cause problems in the Gulf. So it has nothing to do with the sanctions. It is a message to China that Iran, don't panic, Iran is not going to cause problems. The final point is that Iran's exports are 1.7 million barrels a day. Something happened just before the attack by Israel on Iran. The last 2 weeks before the attack, Iran oil exports increased substantially to levels we have not seen in a very, very long time. At the same time, who is the main customer of Iran? It's China. We've seen Chinese inventories go up to the highest on record, the highest in the history of China. And the idea here is, even if we lose some oil from the Gulf, even if there is no ceasefire, China can dip into that inventories and literally compensate because it is the same crude in terms of quality. It's the same Iranian crude being stored. So they are not going to have any problems at all. And they can go for months without even increasing imports from other countries to replace the Iranian imports. So the idea here is, any way you look at it, the impact on the oil market is very limited.
So is that why we saw the Americans encouraging China to get through to Iran? Because the Chinese seem to have been very...
It's not really encouraging China. It's really, I mean, President Trump said something later on about he feels sorry for the Iranian because they need the money. But it is part of the ceasefire deal that the Iranians will not cause any disruptions. And he wanted to convey that message quickly to China by telling them through that tweet, look, there are no problems.
All right. So then in the past 2 weeks, oil didn't really do what we expected it to do. There was an expectation that, at the beginning of this week, markets would open after the US struck for Dow and the other facilities, installations, whatever. And there would be a surge, we would see oil rise. And it went up and then it went down again to what it was before the US got involved. Can you take us through what is going on there? Sure. Was it because the US was telegraphing way before that it was going to do something, and so that gave time the markets to sort of absorb the fear?
If you look at Brent, basically, we did exceed 80. And there was no reason for it. But because a lot of people around the world thought, because the media kept saying that Iran will close the Hormuz Strait. And I have basically kind of an idea on what was going on, because it seemed that some media sources and others basically took advantage of the situation to emphasize the idea that this is a troubled area. This is a troubled area, and therefore buy my oil. This is troubled area, therefore buy my LNG. Don't buy from them. So it seemed that some people were riding the wave of the news that, look, there are problems here, therefore this area is not safe, and therefore buy oil from the United States, buy LNG from the United States, buy it from Brazil, buy it from Norway, but don't buy it from from that region, because we've seen kind of intense efforts kind of to show that Iran can block the Hormuz Strait while they cannot. But the issue here is we have this political premium, which has no reason for, as I mentioned, and then when that political premium or the reason is basically in the mind of people gone, then we lost it. But if you look at how prices collapsed, it is clear that the information of the ceasefire was leaked about 12 hours early, because as Iran was sending those missiles to Qatar, we saw prices drop substantially, which does not make any sense. But it makes sense when you know that the news of the ceasefire was leaked. And now, if we look at the oil market, it is underpriced. So prices should go up because market fundamentals right now support higher prices than the current price by about $3 to $4. So Brent should go back to around 73, 74, 75. That's where the market forces basically are telling us where the price should be.
All right. Well, one question I have also is about, I was reading an interesting Reuters article yesterday, and it was highlighting, well, one of the main points it was emphasizing was that sort of the declining influence of the Middle East on oil prices. Would you agree with that sentiment?
No, I think there is a complete misunderstanding of what's going on, and I'm going to explain it in a very simple way.
Right.
People think, especially in the media, they think if OPEC Plus cut production, then prices should go up. And if prices do not go up, then they say, well, there is no influence, therefore it's a failure. What they miss basically is when OPEC Plus meets and they cut production, they don't cut production because of something happened in the past. They cut production because of something they see in the future. And what they see in the future is that prices will decline. And we are going to end up with a surplus. We are going to see inventories going up and demand is not growing. And therefore, their efforts is to prevent prices from going down, not raising prices. So there is a complete misunderstanding of what OPEC Plus does. The objective is to prevent oil prices from declining, not to raise prices. But the media look at it, well, they announced a production cut and prices did not go up, therefore it's a failure. No, it's not a failure. Because if you look at OPEC Plus cuts, if they did not cut in the last 3 years, prices would have declined probably to the low 30s for an extended period of time. And prices today would be above $100 because that would have destroyed massive amount of production around the world. So when they say it's not effective simply because they misunderstood what's going on in the market. $75 or 70 today is really good. Remember, we were at 30 and 40, we were kind of dreaming about 70. So $70 is still good. Companies, even in the United States, can still make money. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's not like the money they make at 100, but they are still making money. So it is the misunderstanding of how OPEC behave or OPEC Plus that is causing the belief that they are less effective, but they are not. In fact, if you look at OPEC Plus in the last 4 or 5 years, probably it's more powerful than ever relative to the failures of the past.
Now, you mentioned OPEC Plus. Obviously, one key element to that is Moscow. Moscow's been rather unique in its relationship with Iran, obviously vis-a-vis Ukraine and the war. But what's your assessment there of Russia's calculus? They weren't as vocal as we might have thought them to be. They weren't going to get it involved physically or kinetically. But what do you think Russia's calculation is when it comes to energy security with Iran and the Middle East?
The issue that we have to pay attention to is that when the war in Ukraine started, and people start talking about sanctions, we've seen big banks, the IEA, and US politicians talking about a decline in Russia's production by 3 to 5 million barrels a day. And people price that in, and prices jump from 80 to 130, thinking that we will lose 3 to 5 million barrels a day. We did not lose that. So that was another mistake by the media, by politicians, by analysts. We did not lose that. And what Russia did, basically, despite the sanctions, is literally make sure that the sanctions are ineffective. But the fact is, the way sanctions were designed to be ineffective. Russian oil still reaches the United States and Europe today, despite all the sanctions. It's not directly. And that was by design. If you go even and look at the language, they say, well, if the Russian crude is somehow modified, it can reach Europe, which means that it can go to India or China or any other country. It's refined, and then now it's modified. And if it's modified, it can go back to Europe and the United States. And then people scream, well, we are financing Putin. Yeah, you are financing Putin because you are buying that oil, and you are buying it by design for fear that the sanctions will be effective and oil prices will remain high at 130 forever because of this. The fact is, if you look at what's been going on with Russian oil and gas, it is clear right now that the Russian objective, or at least the Putin administration objective, is this, that they learned their lesson, that they put all their eggs in one basket on Europe, and it backfired. They really underestimated the power of US shale. They underestimated the willingness of US politicians, basically, to bring that natural LNG to Europe. They really underestimated that. So now they learned their lesson. Their objective is to do two things. So, okay, I don't have Europe. I have only China. But if I have only China, then I'm repeating the same mistake with Europe. Therefore, I have to diversify my oil exports, and I have to diversify my gas exports. And the only way to diversify my oil exports is to refine that oil. And the reason why, when Lavrov basically toured the world trying to find markets for US oil after the sanctions, and that's in 2023 and 2024, he learned a very important lesson, that many countries, especially in Africa, wants to buy the Russian oil, but they don't have refineries. And therefore, the idea of selling the crude was a bad idea because they cannot sell it. So they said, okay, well, now we have to emphasize refineries. And therefore, we have to export the diesel and gasoline, everything to those countries because they are willing to buy it. They are willing to pay us despite the sanctions, but it has to be refined. And therefore, the attacks by Ukraine on those Russian refineries has a strategic dimension aside from the war, because it hits a very kind of like strategic decision to diversify exports, and that does not fit with the supporters of Ukraine. The second one is they know that they have little chance in Europe for natural gas. They directed some of it to China, but again, they don't want to be a hostage to Chinese economy if there are problems in it, or the Chinese politics. So they want to diversify gas exports. But to do so, the only way they can do it is to focus on LNG, because they cannot send this gas to Latin America or to Africa or to Egypt or anywhere else unless it's LNG. They cannot do the pipes. So they emphasized LNG, and by the time they emphasized the LNG, the US came in and imposed very heavy sanctions, not on gas exports or energy export, on the infrastructure itself, which tell us that the sanctions on infrastructure and LNG carriers has nothing to do with Ukraine. This is a strategic decision by the United States. It's separate from the Ukrainian sanctions that focuses on LNG simply because they want to prevent Russia from that diversification and the extra income they get in the next 50 years or 100 years or so. So it is very clear that they want to hit the refining sector, they want to hit the LNG sector, because that's what gives more power to Russia by diversification.
Well, on the United States, I've got another question for you on sort of broader bloc alignments in a second. But what about the US in this? Where does their role with their LNG shale gas come into this, or it doesn't really, in terms of, I don't know, replacing?
What I'm going to say, for many people, probably this is the first time they will hear this. The US LNG is an integral part of US foreign policy. And we learned this from 2014. A decision was taken by the deep state. And when I say deep state in the United States, that means something that Democrats and Republicans agree on, which means that regardless of who is in the White House, they agree on this thing. And what they agree on is the use of LNG as a tool in foreign policy. And we've seen Trump supporting that. We've seen Biden supporting that. So in 2014, after Putin annexed Crimea, and then sanctions were imposed on Russia, the US made a decision since 2014 to replace Russian gas in Europe by supporting LNG. So they supported the companies that were building the LNG terminals in full force. And now the United States is the largest exporter of LNG in the world. And they did replace the Russian gas in Europe. But Putin realized since then that what the game is. So he knew. So what we've seen two things here. First of all, he wanted to build Nord Stream 2 to Germany. He was waiting for foreign investment to come in. It did not come in. But for fear of US LNG, he decided to invest in it. He put billions of dollars. He expedited the project to get the Nord Stream 2 as soon as possible to Germany before the US LNG. And he underestimated the will of the United States because after he finished the project, they pressured Germany to say no, and they locked it. They closed it. But before that, there was another development that is very important. In 2016, after the collapse in oil prices in 2015, OPEC said, look, I am not going to cut production. I'm not going to support prices unless non-OPEC producers come to the table and cut too. I'm not going to carry the burden on my own. So OPEC contacted other producers and told them, look, oil prices are going to stay low unless you cooperate. So they brought in 10 more members and they formed the OPEC Plus. So OPEC Plus now is OPEC, 12 members, and then 10 members who are non-OPEC members, including Russia. So we have 22. So the agreement was signed in 2016. If you study those meetings since 2016 until 2020, what do you see? That Russia always objected to large cuts. The Saudis wanted to go for large cuts, and Russia always objected. And that led to the price war in March 2020. If you recall, when they went to that meeting and the meeting collapsed and the Saudis flooded the market and prices collapsed even before COVID.
Yes.
Why the Russians were doing this? If you go back and search this on Google or any other AI, you'll find out that there were many reports saying that Putin wants to kill US shale. Putin wants to kill US shale. That's absolutely correct. But why he wants to kill US shale? Because his main competitor is LNG. And the gas coming to LNG is associated gas coming from shale plays like the Permian in Texas. So if he lowers oil prices, keep them low, then oil production is not going to increase, and therefore they are not going to find enough gas for LNG to compete with him in Europe. So that's where the difference between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Saudi Arabia wanted higher prices. Russia wanted moderate prices so shale production will not grow, so they won't lose on gas. Russia is an oil and gas exporter. Saudi Arabia is only an oil exporter. So they are not related to gas. So the interest basically is completely different. And that's why the reviews on production cuts were different.
Interesting. So what does this tell us about bloc reorientation more broadly, realignment? Iran has obviously been building tacit improvements. Countries have been hedging with Iran, say even Turkey, in recent years. So after the events of the past couple of weeks, do you think there's going to be another realignment, so to speak, over energy issues?
No, not really. Here is the issue that we are facing right now, regardless of all of this. The reality of the market is this. With the introduction of climate change policies, with the massive growth in solar and wind and renewable energy around the world, we are seeing more competition among energy sources than ever on the supply side. And that's kind of a new regime in a sense. And what's add to the problems is that China is the number one in investment in renewable energy and number one in the expansion of solar and wind. But at the same time, it is number one in the expansion of coal. Although also what we've seen in the last 2 years, that the government basically literally told its companies, go and invest in oil and gas within Chinese borders. That is very important because it is very clear that the expansion in renewables, the expansion in coal, the expansion of oil and gas has nothing to do, or especially the renewables, has nothing to do with climate change. China is preparing for either war or sanctions, and they want more domestic energy sources just in case of war or sanctions. And that's why they are literally expanding everything, all energy sources, not only solar and wind. So this is really the new game that will kind of cover all the others. Whatever we see in geopolitics, this is just temporary, while the one that's going to last with us is this competition between those energy sources. To give you an example on this competition, it happened in Europe several times, in the UK where you are right now, when wind stops. All of a sudden, wind stops, the price of natural gas goes through the roof, Demand for natural gas increases. Now they want more LNG. As more LNG basically comes to Europe because of the higher prices, now Asia cannot pay that price and tankers being diverted, now they use more coal. So we started with wind, moved to gas, and now we ended up with coal. That was not the case several years ago. Everything was rigid, in a sense, engraved in stone. Now we see those flexibilities, and LNG prices are playing a big role in these substitutions, and renewable energy basically is mostly the trigger to cause those substitutions.
So, as the sort of final question, I suppose, for you is obviously forward looking. What would you expect to happen in the short to medium term around everything we've discussed if Iran does reach some kind of nuclear arrangement with the United States or goes in the complete opposite direction? And what would you encourage people to look out for as well? Expectations versus outlook.
There is one point, and then I'll move on to the outlook. People have to realize that after Qatar expands all its LNG by 2027 or probably a couple of years later, and the US basically build all its stuff, etc., the only country that is underdeveloped when it comes to the massive natural gas resources that can compete with Russia, that can compete with the United States, or can fill a gap in the future demand is Iran. So the world cannot ignore Iran, because if you are looking at 2050 or more, that's really a big problem there. We need Iran because they are they have the second largest gas reserves in the world. So that's number one. Number two, if you look at energy demand worldwide, energy demand is increasing substantially, and it's been really higher than the past for several reasons. One of them is urbanization, the other one is immigration, and the third one is AI and data centers. But there is another important point that people are overlooking, and analysts and the media are overlooking, which is those poor countries, as they get richer and incomes go up, how they spend their money. People miss this point, because when poor people get richer, or even middle class get richer, they are not going to eat double. They are not going to wear two jackets at once just because they have money to buy another jacket. But they are going to look for more comfort. More comfort. And more comfort, one of the more comfort things is not only the gadgets and the getting refrigerators and microwaves and this stuff which consumes more energy, air conditioning. We've seen this in several places, and ACs, air conditioners, are heavy users of energy. So this is an element that people are missing. That look at Africa, it's a very hot region. Look at Latin America, it's a very large part of it is a very hot region. So the demand for air conditioning basically is going to increase energy demand substantially. So we have urbanization, we have migration, we have AI and data centers, and then we have this comfort thing. What that means is the implications are significant, because the climate change pundits are telling us that they want to replace natural gas and coal in power generation. But if demand is growing this much, we need all energy sources, and therefore the replacement is not going to take place. And therefore, the demand for oil, natural gas, and coal is going to be higher than all current forecasts. And therefore, this idea of peak oil demand or peak gas, etc., does not make any sense. We might end up with multiple peaks because of various conditions, but we are not going to have a terminal peak, at least in our lifetime. If you look at China right now, and probably we'll end with this, if you look at China, for example, we have predictions even from Chinese oil companies that gasoline demand is going to peak this year or next year. Oil demand is going to peak in the next 2 years. Many organizations around the world basically are adopting those views. It's a complete nonsense. And one of the issues that we ended up with a scam that we reported recently on EVs in China, because it looks like the numbers of sales are hugely exaggerated. Exaggerated for two reasons. And people really need to realize the extent of this corruption. The government and state governments in China give subsidies to new cars. And new cars, basically, they have to record that they have zero mileage. So sometimes bureaucracy, basically, you have to pay the price for bureaucracy, because part of that bureaucracy, how to show a new car? Well, to show a new car, you have to show zero mileage. So even if you bring an old car, as long as you show zero mileage, it's a new car. Mm-hmm. So what some dealers basically were doing is they bring those old cars, sell them over and over and over with zero mileage, zero mileage, zero mileage, zero mileage. So that was one exaggeration so they can get the subsidies. The other exaggeration is the subsidies are for Chinese. So manufacturers and dealers, basically what they were doing is they literally, in a sense, like almost sell the car to themselves, issue license plate, get the subsidies, and now the car is a used car because it already have a license plate. And then they export it to the rest of the world as a used car. So we have double counting here. So the numbers are exaggerated, and therefore the impact on oil demand is way lower than what the pundits are telling us. Of course, there are other reasons, probably we don't have enough time for it, but the impact, I can sum it up with this statement, that even if you take the actual numbers that we reported, even with the fake numbers, you take just whatever is written there, the impact on oil demand is way, way lower because of miscalculations on several fronts. So to conclude, we are not going to see a peak oil demand, as they say in 25 or 26 in China. We are not going to see a global peak oil demand. Based on our research, and for those who are interested, basically it was on Substack, 75% of the decline in growth in oil demand in China is related to economic growth, is not related to anything else.
Right.
It's not related to EVs or LNG trucks or anything else. So it is really about economic growth at the end.
Quite the sticking point, I think, to end on there, Anas. It's a pleasure to have you on, and it's why I was very keen to have you on. You cut through the noise and do differ quite a lot with what the prevailing narratives are on mainstream media, and I do encourage people who are watching and listening to, well, go and check out your Substack and your work more broadly, because I think it's exceptionally well put, but also accessible for those who might just be beginning to understand or research into it. So that's it from us, everyone. But thank you very much for watching. And as we say on the Global Gambit, you've either got to get playing or be played. And certainly that's more applicable than ever. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.